Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. During the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question, you may press star 1 on your phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I would like to turn the meeting over to Ms. Portland Ridley. Ms. Ridley, you may begin your conference.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Portland Ridley, and I'm a project officer at the Suicide Prevention Branch at SAMHSA. With me today is other members from our campus team, Roz Blozier and Jennifer Capella. Before we begin with today's webinar, we would like to make a very important announcement at this time. As follow-up to our first webinar that we had a few weeks ago on May 1st. During that May 1st webinar, we provided incorrect information, specifically about employees of campuses who help and write and also work on the development of the grant application. We wanted to clarify that employees on your campus who are involved in the writing and the preparation of the application may also work on the grant if the grant is awarded. However, please note that the time used to write and work on the grant cannot be reimbursed under grant funds. Also, for clarification, contracted grant writers, hired grant writers, who are contracted to write your grant application cannot be employed by the grant if an award is made. So that was an important announcement we wanted to make as follow-up to our May 1st webinar. So we will begin. So if you're a prospective applicant and you're interested in applying for a campus suicide prevention grant, you need more information about the process, then you're at the right place this afternoon. The purpose of this webinar is to provide you with an overview of the application, submission process, and highlight important requirements. Please note that the content of this presentation is based on the content of the RFA and the frequently asked questions document. We ask that you have the RFA in front of you as we go through this presentation, as we will reference that document at various times. In fact, for most of the slides, we have actually identified the page number or the section where you can find the information in the RFA. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be on posted on the SPRC website, which is www.sprc.gov through May 28th. So let's begin. www.sprc.org. So I will turn it over to Roz Blozier.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. So this grant is sponsored by SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And SAMHSA is one of 11 operating divisions in the Department of Health and Human Services. And we specifically are part of the Suicide Prevention Branch in the Center for Mental Health Services here at SAMHSA. Okay. The Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act was named for former Senator Gordon Smith's son, Garrett, who died by suicide when he was in college. And the act was passed actually in 2004. Since 2005, we have been able to fund grants on college campuses across the country. Initially, these grants were at $75,000 per year for each of 3 years, and now they're at $102,000 each year for 3 years. And to date, we have awarded 175 grants to 160 institutions of higher education. That was because early on in our grant program, campuses were allowed to reapply, but that's no longer the case. And you'll notice at the bottom that with this new grant cycle, we anticipate 14 grantees will be funded. So just kind of a note, a caveat, this program is being announced prior to the appropriation for SAMHSA's programs, with funding estimates based on the President's budget request. So applications are invited based on the assumption that sufficient funds will be appropriated to permit funding of a reasonable number of applications solicited. All the applicants are reminded, however, that we cannot guarantee that sufficient funds will be appropriated to permit SAMHSA to fund any applications. I can only say that to date, we have always been able to go forward with funding of applications, but we just can't say anything until that money is actually there for us. And the board and funding details of the RFA are as described. So you see that the application is due by the 27th of May, and that in terms of another important point, that there is a cost-sharing requirement, and the grant period is, the length of the project is 3 years. Okay. So let's take a moment to talk about eligibility. Public, private colleges and universities, schools with religious affiliations, minority-serving institutions, community colleges, graduate and professional schools, as well as tribal colleges may apply. We welcome applications. However, eligibility does have some limitations. Entities that have previously been awarded a Garrett Lee Smith grant are not eligible to apply for funding. However, if a campus is in a different location and part of a regional system and identified as a different university, then an application can be submitted. And I always like to give this example. Many, many years ago, Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, was one of our grantees, and more recently, one of our current grantees is Purdue Fort Worth. So just for those of you who are in that kind of situation, just be aware that it is okay. Also, if your campus has received any other kind of SAMHSA grant, that does not make you ineligible. We're just talking about the Garrett Lee Smith Campus Suicide Prevention Grant. And if you've received any funds from the state Garrett Lee Smith grant program, you also continue, yes, to be eligible. So if your campus was ever a part of a consortium, we had a consortium some years ago in Florida, we've had them in Oregon, as long as your campus was not the one that signed the application, the one that was legally and financially responsible, then you are free to apply for a grant. And in terms of consortia, it is definitely possible to join with other campuses to work on suicide prevention, either in your area, in your region. We just caution against getting too many campuses involved, just because it can become, burdensome to get everybody to work together. But only one campus is going to end up being the legal and financial, have legal and financial responsibility. So it just turns out that over the years we've found that grants have been administered out of counseling centers, wellness centers, academic departments, graduate programs, psychological training clinics, student organizations. Okay. So the purpose of this grant program is to help you develop a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention at your institution. We're encouraging you to consider a public health perspective to viewing suicide prevention as a concern for the entire campus community. In other words, suicide prevention is not just the responsibility of the counseling center. And while we surely understand that $102,000 will not enable you to do as much as you might wish, it can certainly help you get started in building the infrastructure for your programming. This is an infrastructure grant. It does not matter if you aren't doing anything now related to suicide prevention. You just tell us what the needs are of your campus, what your plans are, and how you intend to use the grant funds to move these ideas along. So you're going to need to assess or plan to assess your suicide prevention needs and develop an infrastructure so that you will have increased capacity to enhance and sustain effective prevention programs. In fact, SAMHSA's first strategic initiative is the prevention of substance abuse and mental illness, which this grant addresses. Also in this section, there is mention of special populations of high risk, LGBT, American Indian, Alaska Natives, and military family members and veterans. Be sure to include some statements as to how you might specifically address the needs of these populations. Remember, this is an infrastructure grant, which means that funds cannot be used to provide clinical services, and you cannot use clinical services for your match. Okay, this grant is interesting in that it has 6 identified allowable activities, but I can tell you, speaking for myself and my 2 colleagues, that The interpretation of these 6 areas has just been very, very broad and incredibly creative as we've watched campuses unfold their programs across the country. Important to note is that you do not have to select all 6 areas to work on. It does not give you a higher score in your evaluation if you decide to do all 6. You know, you really need to think about what your capacity is in terms of you know, employee availability. It has to make sense in terms of what you decide to undertake. So one area of allowable activity is developing training programs for students, faculty, and staff, and we call these gatekeeper training programs. And they help to instruct attendees on how to respond effectively to students dealing with issues that could lead to suicide attempts or completions. I would like to say that SAMHSA does not endorse any particular gatekeeper training program, and in fact, we like to encourage people to take the 1-hour online training at www.SPRC, that's the Suicide Prevention Resource Center.org, their website, to kind of help you think about which gatekeeper training might make the most sense on your particular campus. So these gatekeeper trainings might be targeted to high-risk groups or possibly to the entire student body. They may be targeted to resident advisors, to first responders, coaches, student leaders. And examples of some gatekeeper programs might be QPR, Assist, Campus Connect, or, in fact, a program that you design yourself. The next allowable activity has to do with creating a networking infrastructure with your community. So some campuses don't have mental and behavioral health services or possibly are limited in these services on their campus. So the idea is to work on developing a network, a link to providers in the community. And, you know, to ease the way so that there's a nice warm transfer made with a student who's in need of, you know, of clinical services, maybe beyond what your campus is able to provide. It's very important for the campus to pay attention to what the crisis response protocol is on their campus, or to kind of understand that they're going to have to be working on developing a crisis protocol and a post-vention plan, because we obviously don't want services to be provided on a campus where there's not a plan for how to deal with students in distress. Next are educational seminars for students, faculty, and staff, and it might include information on suicide prevention, risk or protective factors, promoting health seeking, reducing stigma. And again, these would be programs that are already created or ones that you develop yourself. It's very often a very large task for a campus to develop their own crisis line, but we really like to encourage campuses to promote the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or to possibly work with their local crisis center in their community. And this kind of promotion is often done on the marketing materials that campuses develop. Next is developing your own or using materials that are already created to provide information to the campus community, addressing warning signs, symptoms of depression, promoting health seeking, and reducing stigma. And finally is obtaining or preparing educational materials for family members to increase their awareness of potential stresses in a student's life. And we find that, you know, parents are really almost like first-line responders. So we really want to bring them into the programming.
Okay. So we've just covered what's allowable under the grant application. We'd like to just review with you what is not allowable. And there are several activities that are not allowed under this program. One of the most common mistakes we see is when applicants propose to use grant funds to provide direct client-level treatment or clinical services. Please do not request any programming or funding for direct clinical mental health service, which includes any kind of therapy, counseling, medication management, or the development of treatment plans. This grant is not a research grant. It is not a fellowship or a training grant. Funds must strictly be used for infrastructure development. Here are some other funding restrictions listed on this slide. Another common mistake we see is because you're in the campus community, applicants propose to use grant funds for scholarships, fellowships, stipends as a form of compensation in lieu of wages for students, graduate interns, or fellows. For example, when you're using stipends or another fee-for-service payment to pay for students, working on the project is not allowed. Instead, please use the traditional direct wages, that is hourly fee, when you're developing personal costs for your staffing plan, including student workers. Also, applicants often provide stipends or curriculum fees as an in-kind match. This is not allowed. Overall, any activity or cost that is not allowed in the project cannot be used as toward your in-kind contribution or match contribution. Another common question we receive is regarding incentives. Incentives are allowed for purposes of encouraging students to participate or attend your outreach, training, or education activities. These are allowed. Non-cash incentives, however, cannot exceed $30. Please note that faculty and staff members cannot receive incentives, only students. For this grant, you can apply up to $102,000, which includes both direct and indirect costs for each budget year of this 3-year grant program. Direct costs are those incurred in implementing the grant project, such as salaries, fringe benefits, equipment, supplies, contractual, and travel costs. Indirect costs, often referred to as overhead, refers to administrative costs, such as electricity or central administrative services. SAMHSA does not accept a research indirect cost rate. Please be sure to coordinate with your business office for your institution's non-research indirect cost rate. So you ask, what is an indirect cost? It is an established indirect cost rate based on a federally negotiated agreement. Please note, again, that SAMHSA does not accept research or indirect cost rates. And I'm sorry, this is a repeat slide. So what if your organization does not have an established indirect cost rate? Many of you may be new to SAMHSA grants or the federal grants, and that is okay. In your application, please simply state that you intend to negotiate an established indirect rate with the federal grant, with the federal government, if you are awarded the grant. Okay? So now we're going to talk about cost sharing and match requirements, which is a requirement for this program. Grantees must provide matching funds from other non-federal resources, either directly or through donations from public or private entities. You must provide a dollar match for every dollar federal funds by the end of the 3-year project period. Please note that you don't have to necessarily do a one-on-one match for each year. Just meet the match requirement by the end of the project period. So basically, you have 3 years to come up with a total match. So you ask, what constitutes as an in-kind contribution or a non-federal match? This non-federal match may be made in cash or in kind. Your match must be used for activities that are clearly related to one of the 6 allowable activities described in the Campus Suicide Prevention RFA. For example, as a match, you can designate a portion of a counseling center clinician's salary based on the percentage of time he or she plans and conducts suicide prevention training programs for your campus personnel. Other common examples of in-kind contributions include your university's cost for printing brochures, internet service costs, space rental costs that you use to host meetings or trainings. We find that the most common, though, in-kind contribution is actually salary, wage, and fringe costs. So now I will turn it over to Jennifer Capella, who will be handling the next few sections.
Thanks, Portland. Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about data collection and performance measurement and what our expectations of our grants are for this area, and then I'll talk a little bit later about the content of your application. So there are 3 different expectations SAMHSA has for evaluation for our grantees. The first is the cross-site evaluation. The cross-site evaluation addresses core questions about the products and services that you're developing in your grant, the trainings you're conducting, the knowledge and awareness that you're, and utilization of suicide prevention activities, and the at-risk students that are being referred for campus services. The cross-site evaluation is managed by a SAMHSA contractor, and that contractor is going to be responsible for collecting all of the data through a web-based system, and you'll be required to support and facilitate this process by completing reports, serving as respondents, identifying appropriate respondents, and entering and submitting data into this web interface. The second requirement is the TRACK requirement. TRACK stands for Transformation Accountability. This is a web-based program as well, but it's managed by SAMHSA, and it's used to assess and monitor the extent to which a project is meeting its goals, as you outlined in your proposal, or you will outline in your proposal. TRACK, unlike the cross-site evaluation, TRACK is not necessarily an evaluation. It's more used for performance measurement to determine how well your grant is reaching its goals. And please note that everybody who is funded for this grant is going to receive extensive training on both of those tools once the grants are awarded. Finally, any funded grantee is going to be required to do a local performance assessment, which is more qualitative in nature. It's basically in your progress reports, we'll be asking you to determine if you are achieving your goals and objectives as you intended and whether you need to make any adjustments to your project. You'll report on the progress achieved, barriers encountered, and efforts to overcome these barriers. You can use the data that you collect for your cross-site and TRACK to help you answer the applicant process questions that are listed in the RFA. Also, please make a note that when you are writing your budget and you're doing the evaluation portion of your application, SAMHSA limits your spending to 20% of your budget. So only 20% of your budget can be spent on performance assessment and evaluation. Based on our experience, this is a very time-consuming task. In terms of evaluation in general is time-consuming. So we urge you to include adequate personnel, time, and resources into the grant proposal so that you can meet the evaluation requirements with everything else you have going on. So I'm going to turn it back to Portland for some questions, I think.
So yeah, before we continue and move on to the next part of this webinar, I want to stop here for questions and answers. Operator, please kindly open up the lines. So if you have any, questions about what we've provided so far in the presentation, such as eligibility requirements, cost sharing, allowable or non-allowable activities, please ask.
Thank you. At this time, we will begin a question and answer session. To ask a question, please press *1 on your phone. Please unmute your phone and when prompted, record your first and last name. Once again, if you would like to ask a question at this time, please press *1. One moment as we wait for our first question. Our first call from Mr. Gabriel.
Hello.
Your line is open. You may ask your question now.
Operator, seems to be an echo.
Who are you asking the question to? This is David at Texas Southern University. Can I ask the question?
Yes, please.
Hi, David.
Hi, yeah, my question is, our normal indirect cost rate is 51%. If we charge 10%, can we take 41% as an in-kind contribution?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No further questions at this time.
Okay, so we are going to move on and review the application review criteria. So please continue to have the RFA in front of you as a reference, and I will turn it back to Jen. Jen.
Okay, hi everybody, Jen. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about the content of your application. We're going to talk about the 4 sections that are contained in the project narrative, and then I'm going to talk about key requirements that you have to meet for each section. Please remember to read this section carefully and respond to each bulleted item. If you find that you're being redundant throughout your application because you're responding to each bulleted item in each section, don't worry about it. If we ask you to say it twice, we'll just say it twice. Section A is the statement of need. This is where you need to provide demographic information on the population or populations that you're going to serve. You want to discuss the target population and cultural backgrounds, languages, beliefs, norms, and values that you have to consider in delivering programs to that population. In this section, you're also going to need to describe the institution's need for the fundable activities or whichever activities you propose in your application. The activities are identified in Section 1.2.2 of your RFA. You also need to talk about your current efforts to address those needs and whether you have any programming or infrastructure on your campus already. In this section, please document the need for an enhanced infrastructure to increase the capacity to implement, sustain, and improve effective mental health services by describing your current suicide prevention activities, if any exist. So just like that. If you have a suicide prevention or crisis response plan, we ask that you include it as an attachment and attachment 5 in your application. If you do not have a suicide prevention or crisis response plan, then we ask you to state so in your proposal. Also, please be sure to describe the service gaps, barriers, and other problems related to the need for infrastructure development for suicide prevention on your campus. Now, we're going to talk about evaluation criteria in the proposed approach. We're going to talk about the proposed approach, not the evaluation criteria. The proposed approach is the largest section of your application. This is where the meat of your application is. It also has one of the highest review criteria. The first bulleted item in this section asks you to describe the purpose of your project, including a clear statement of its goals and objectives, and how it will address the SAMHSA strategic initiatives discussed in Section 1 of the RFA. These must clearly relate to the performance measures you identify in Section D, which is performance assessment and data. Your plan must also describe how the needs of youth at high risk identified by the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention will be addressed. These populations include, but are not limited to, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender youth, American Indians and Alaskan Natives, military family members, and veterans. Be sure that you describe a plan to address the needs of high-risk populations you identify. A common mistake we see in proposals is that an applicant will describe the needs of the high-risk population, but then they fail to include a plan on how to address those needs. For each of the activities that you are requesting funding for, you have to describe the problem, the activity aims to address, the goal or the outcome expected, and how the activity is going to be implemented to achieve the desired outcome or goal. Discuss how the achievement of the goals will address the purpose of the Campus Suicide Prevention Grant Program, and the needs you identify in Section A of your project narrative. It's important that your response to this bullet item is integrated and consistent with other sections of your application. So this is where it's important to remember that all of your application has to be consistent from page 1 to page 25. It's important that that your budget is also reflective of what you write in your application. Please provide a chart or graph depicting a realistic timeline as well for your entire project, showing key activities, milestones, and responsible staff. The program management timeline should be part of the project narrative, so do not place it in the attachment. It is part of the page limit for the entire project narrative. You also need to describe your plans to continue the project after the funding period ends. Talk about how program continuity will be maintained if there's a change in operational environment, like if you have some staff turnover, if your project director leaves, or that sort of thing. Also, in the proposed approach, you're going to have to provide a percentage or dollar amount of your grant funds that are going to be used towards infrastructure development, mental illness prevention and promotion, data collection and performance assessment, and grant administration. When we talk about infrastructure, we're referring to the time and money that you spend on policy development, your gatekeeper trainings, suicide crisis response protocols that you develop, any system capacity or system changes that occur during the grant, and any partnerships or collaborations that you develop with other agencies, things that are going to sustain themselves beyond the life of your grant. Mental illness prevention and promotion talks about time and resources that we allocate towards public awareness campaigns, any outreach that we do on campus, awareness activities, educational materials that are provided, or any products that you develop. I'd like to reiterate that only 20% of your total budget for data collection and performance assessment can be allocated. 20% of your total budget can be allocated for data collection and performance assessment. So that number in that section cannot exceed 20%. Grant administration refers to general activities that are required for the overall management of the grant and overall management and administration of the grant project, and that includes things like time and money spent on activities like writing quarterly and annual reports, attending grantee meetings, budget monitoring, fiscal reporting, and closeout. Now we're going to talk about staff management and relevant experience, Section C. Section C, in this section, you are to discuss your institution's capability and experience in public and campus health, mental and behavioral health, and suicide prevention. While you're writing this section, make sure that you describe your experience in providing culturally appropriate and competent services as well. You also need to provide a complete list of staff positions for the project, including the project director and any other key personnel. We've asked for the role and responsibility for each position, and then their level of effort and qualifications, like their CV or resume. It's important to remember that you also describe how key staff have experience and qualifications in serving your target populations that you write into your application. Overall, you want to make sure that the staffing plan outlined in this section of your application is consistent and integrated with the personnel section outlined in your budget. Like I said before, your application has to relate to your budget. A common mistake we find in applications is when an applicant describes a staff position in this section, but then that position is not identified in the budget section at all. Please make a note here that biographical sketches and job descriptions should go in Section F of your application, not in this section. You also need to describe the resources available for the proposed project, such as operative facilities and equipment. Now we are going to move on to Section D, data collection and performance measurement. The last section of the program narrative is performance assessment and data. It also has the highest number of assigned review points. In this section, you need to document your ability to collect and report on the required performance measures as they are specified in Section 1.2.3 of the RSA. Talk about your plan for data collection, management, analysis, and reporting, and specify and justify any additional measures you plan to use for your grant project. Some grants decide to do a local evaluation early on, so we'd like to know what your plans are for that as well, although that's not required. You also have to describe how your data will be used to manage the project and assure continuous quality improvement, including consideration of disparate outcomes for different racial and ethnic groups. Also remember to describe how information related to process and outcomes will be routinely communicated to program staff. You need to describe your plan for conducting the local performance assessment and document your ability to conduct the assessment. Finally, you have to explicitly state your willingness to work and collaborate with SAMHSA's evaluation technical advisors, specifically stating that you are willing to collaborate with the suicide prevention cost-site evaluation, that you're willing to comply with all of CMHS's necessary GIPA requirements, including submitting your GIPA data into the track system, which I talked about before, and that you'll work with SPRC. One more time, I would like to warn you that this takes a lot of time and commitment, so make sure that you ensure that you allocate adequate resources to data collection and performance assessment. Now we're going to talk about, so now the project narrative is the most important section of your application because it lays out why you want this grant and what you intend to do with it. The project narrative, there are, We're done. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
We're going to go to the budget section of your grant, which you must include a budget for each project year. You must provide a narrative justification of items included in your proposed budget, as well as a description of existing resources and other support you expect to receive for the proposed project. There are 3 budget sections. One is a budget table showing individual budget breakdown costs by cost category. 2 is your narrative justifying your budget costs. The third part of your budget section is your budget summary table, which should display all budget costs for all 3 years in one summary table. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to take the time to look in Appendix F. In Appendix F, you will find a sample illustration of a budget breakdown of costs, budget narrative justification, and a budget summary form. This will help guide you in developing your budget. The most common mistake we see in budgets is when the applicant does not use the sample budget format that we're recommending in Appendix F. Please do not send us any fancy Excel spreadsheets or other formats. It will help ease the review process if you use the budget template in Appendix F to develop your budget section of this application. Another common mistake we see is the lack of budget justification narrative detailing the requested budget costs. For example, a budget may include $9,000 for contractor costs. However, the applicant failed to include information on who, what, and what type of services the contractor is rendering, including the hourly fee and rate. Also, make sure make sure you do not include non-allowable costs in the budget, as well as the match budget section. As a reminder, sections A and D, which I just reviewed, must not exceed 25 pages, which we just reviewed, should not exceed 25 pages. Now we will move on to the supporting documentation, which is section E, F, and G of the RFA. Please note there is no page limit for these sections. Even though points are not associated with these sections, the reviewers will be asked to comment on the appropriateness of this section after the merits of the application have been considered. Section E includes citations, any literature you cite in your application. Section F includes biological sketches for project director and other key positions and your staffing plan. And Section G addresses confidentiality and SAMHSA participant protection human subjects.
So this is Jennifer. I'm going to take just a second to talk about Section G that Portland just mentioned, confidentiality and participant protection. Because of the confidential nature of some of the work that you might be involved with, it's important to have safeguards protecting people from risks associated with their participation on any SAMHSA project. If you go to Appendix G of the RFA, you're going to find guidelines on how to complete this section. There are a total of 7 elements that you must respond to regarding confidentiality and participant protection. Even though no points are associated with this section, it's very important that you respond to every individual bullet item contained in each of the 7 elements. Also be sure to place the correct information under the appropriate bullet item. Many applicants make the mistake of putting information under the wrong heading, which adversely affects the review process. In addition, the section contains specific websites and SAMHSA offices that provide information on protection of human subjects, regulations, and the IRB compliance process.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So at this time, operator, would you please kindly help us open up the lines for questions and answers? Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 on your phone. Please unmute your phone, and when prompted, record your first and last name. Our first question comes from Adele Chell. Mr. Chell, you may ask your question.
Yes, I have some questions, or just a question about the IRB. Can you give us examples of where people have, they don't need to use IRB or address this section if they're just doing standard pre-post surveys?
Okay, this is what has been very confusing to prospective applicants all through the years of our call for applications. We understand that this is not a grant that's going to involve kind of the use of human subjects and that everybody ends up being exempt. But we're just saying to you, you've got to answer the 7 bullets, period. Just answer the questions, okay? And we know that, you may say we're exempt from the IRB requirements. That's okay, but you still have to answer the questions because no matter, like there's one about risk. And, no matter what, it's possible. You want to talk about, for example, that during gatekeeper training, something may get stirred up for a person. So what sort of protocols do you have in place if you have someone who's, you're doing training if someone is running out of the room distressed? Do you pass out little cards about the counseling center? It's those kinds of, it's just kind of common sense responses. Is there unfair selection of participants? And, you would say no and just give some details. But no matter what, you've got to answer all 7 of those bullets.
Thank you.
I'm showing no questions at this time.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up here and just briefly talk about the submission process. And just as a reminder, there are 12 required components to your application found in Section 2.2 of the RFA. And we wanted to remind you that there's a helpful checklist for format requirements in Appendix A. We strongly recommend that you make sure all of the 12 components and formatting requirements are completed. Use this checklist as a resource for you as you complete the application. Please note that your application will be automatically screened out and it will not be reviewed if it does not follow the format instructions or if it is missing any of the 12 components. Okay, so briefly, again, applications are due 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, May 27th. SAMHSA will not accept paper applications. You can only submit your application in one way, and that's electronically through this website that we have described here on the slide, www.grants.gov. If you need more information on the electronic submission procedures, please read Appendix B, which provides detailed instructions on how to submit your application electronically. If you have any other sort of financial business related questions or budget questions later after this webinar, you do have a designated grants management specialist, which is also listed on page 26 of your RFA, which provides detailed information on how to reach Gwen Simpson. She is your contact for any grants management and budget issues. Okay? So I think we're going to stop here again and wrap things up for any final questions that you might have about this RFA. Okay.
We have questions. We have questions.
Great.
First question comes from Fran Cook.
Yes, thank you. On page 31 of the RFP, it looks like there's several file sections in which to submit the grant pieces. I am wondering where the nonprofit status that we have to attach as part of the checklist would go in the overall application.
We're looking here with you, and that is a good question for our grants management office, but we're looking here.
Well, under other attachments.
Your nonprofit status?
If you have documentation that does not pertain to any of the four listed attachment files, include the documentation and other attachments file too.
Okay.
That's what it says.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And we're a state without an SPOC. We're a state educational institution, so I'm wondering if we need to do the piece about
right? The thesis statement, the PPHF.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
If you look at the frequently asked questions, page. I've been answering this question quite a bit, so I just sort of know that. Let me just see. So I have to, page 8.
Page 8 of the frequently asked questions.
Great. Thank you.
A final question comes from Shana from Texas Southern University.
Yes. When is the earliest start date for the funding of this project?
Traditionally projects are funded toward the beginning of the fiscal year, which is the October 2014. However, historically, we've had a couple of times when grants have started earlier, but I think there's a late time for the submission of these applications that will be starting October 1st, but I can't promise. I understand the question. You're probably creating your timeline, so I would support.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Any other questions?
We have another question. Please call and state your name. No further questions.
Okay, well, we also just wanted to, as we wrap things up, remind you of some helpful SAMHSA resources to help you develop your applications. They're listed here. For example, we have SAMHSA resources, and we also have resources available at the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. Very helpful resources that we recommend that you refer to if you need additional support, content support in developing your application. And just for clarification, we will be posting this webinar not on the SAMHSA website, but on the sprc.org website, okay? The webinar recording and the FAQs. Thank you so very much, and have a nice weekend. Thank you, operator. Operator, can we go back in our queue? Pre-conference?
Yes, please hold.
Can you tell us also how many callers there were?
Please. This concludes today's conference. You may disconnect at this time. Thank you for your participation.